Today, the government introduces its controversial online harms bill in Parliament. Proponents believe a much more regulated internet will be safer for people, whilst opponents fear it will stifle entrepreneurialism, free speech, and drive people to use VPNs and the dark web, as they do in countries already with widespread government control of the internet, like Russia and China. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me now to talk through this bill is someone who's been looking at it very carefully for a number of years. Matthew Lesh is the head of public policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome to the programme. First of all, let's go through some of the main facets of this bill. How will this change how we use the internet?
So the basic concept of the bill is that the government is going to impose a so-called duty of care on tech companies. Now, that in itself is meaningless, but they're then going to require them to take very swift action against any content which they have a reasonable likelihood to believe is harmful, or also certain categories of legal but harmful speech. So that's extremely dangerous. The central risk here is that the government will be encouraging companies under the threat of up to 10% of global revenue fines to become quite censorious with their speech. There's also another of other interesting elements of this bill. They're going to require porn blocking unless you enter your driver's license or credit card or potentially even a passport. At the same time, they're going to potentially require companies, in order to access the adult version of, let's say, YouTube, you might have to prove your age as well in order to ensure that children are shown the right types of content. They're also going to be able to require companies to put in place certain technologies to monitor the speech on their platforms. Ofcom will be able to instruct them about the kind of technologies they can use. And there's also, we expect to be in this bill, although we haven't seen the final details, is an updating of the communications offence to create a new harms-based offence where the government will be outlawing speech that could potentially have a psychological harm on other people. So there's an extremely broad range of new parts of this bill. It's quite complex and messy and contradictory.
It's an enormous bill. I'm interested in some of these issues that you've raised there. Firstly, the age verification. Suddenly we will, if this bill goes ahead as it is written, we will have to, on any website that might have adult content on it, whether that be films that are rated, 15 plus or whatever, we're going to have to put in our credit card details to websites that we may or may not trust in order to access that material.
Yeah, as you know, Tom, this has been done before. The government tried to put in place the porn laws a few years ago. They ended up cancelling them and reversing the legislation or not going ahead with the implementation legislation, which was first done in 2015 because it was so inoperable and it raised so many core privacy threats. The very notion that in order to access adult material, particularly pornographic material, you're going to have to identify yourself to the site. Now, that is risking creating a massive honeypot, a huge risk of a database that links people's adult viewing habits to their identity. It's going to encourage people, of course, to use VPNs and to try to get around it. It could lead to blocking on scale overseas websites that choose not to comply with the UK's quite authoritarian rules. There's a bunch of elements here where it's quite interesting. Now, the other element of this as well, and we don't exactly know how this is going to come out in practice, and the government's been very vague about this. In order to use basically any site, any platform that's it, let's say Google. If Google wants to show you things that might not necessarily be appropriate for someone under the age of 18, Google search might need to make you log in and verify your identity as well, so they know what content is appropriate to show you and what content is therefore not appropriate to show you, because by default, they have to assume that you're a child when they're showing you search results. So as a result of that, we could be seeing
So in order to, for example, search for, a horror film that might have a high rating, you'd have to put in your credit card details. It does sound extraordinarily authoritarian there, but I wonder, there's another aspect of this bill, which is about tech executives potentially being fined or even, I think at the most extreme end, imprisoned if they don't comply with taking down user-generated content. I worry about the entrepreneurialism consequences for this. Why would you, as someone anywhere in the world, choose the UK to start a business that involves any sort of user-generated content that you'll have to constantly be screening for, looking for? Some stuff might get through the net, and then you'd be liable. You might go to prison if you formed the next Twitter or the next Facebook in the UK, something that had user-generated content.
Yeah, look, this is the government's big announcement today, is the extension of legal liabilities, criminal liabilities for tech executives who fail to comply, particularly with instructions from Ofcom. I mean, these are literally the tools of authoritarian regimes. This is exactly what we see at the moment in Russia, where the government is doing everything they can to threaten and lock up tech executives. It's been known to be used in other countries where it's effectively a requirement to have a local executive from a tech company, basically someone you can harass in order to get your way. It's a very awful global precedent to be threatening these kind of legal liabilities on tech executives, and yet the government is lauding and celebrating the notion that we're going to be throwing entrepreneurs in jail. And then we ask ourselves, why is Britain a poorer country than the US? Well, the US isn't going after its tech execs and threatening to throw them in jail in this way.
That is extraordinary. Finally, and we've unfortunately only got 30 seconds left, but who gets to define what is legal but harmful? Some things that are going to be banned that are legal, but somehow the government decrees to be harmful?
Well, this is a big announcement today. Is apparently Parliament will have some level of decision making in this process. It'll have to be laid in secondary legislation. We don't know what the accountability mechanisms will be. There, a lot of secondary legislation is laid before Parliament and then is just automatically in law in 40 days. So we don't know whether basically the Secretary of State will have the power to designate, let's say, misinformation or gender critical feminism or whatever it may be as a form of legal but harmful speech, and therefore require tech companies to remove it.
It's extraordinary. This is such an important piece of legislation. I don't think many people quite appreciate how much this may change our lives, given how much of our lives are now lived through the internet. It's got extraordinarily huge consequences. Of course, there are some noble things it attempts to do. How well it will do them, I think, is a very serious question. For now, Matthew Lesh of the IEA, thank you very much for joining us here on The Briefing to talk through those issues.